So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We have people joining us from a lot of different time zones as well. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Stephanie Olivieri. I'm the Climate Mobility Lead at the Migration Youth and Children platform. And it is my pleasure to be here today co-organizing this event together with the Beyond Climate Collaborative and the International School on Climate Mobilities. And we're going to be talking about decoloniality and climate mobility. So here's a little bit of a Zoom etiquette before we start. So if possible, please turn on your camera. We would love to see you, but of course we understand, since I also mentioned that we're in different time zones, that this is not possible. Maybe you're watching us from bed, which is totally fine. So please don't feel forced to do so. Please do write your name and your pronouns in your description. For example, Stephanie Olivieri, she, her, but I know there are a few extra Stephanie Olivieris because we had some tech problems. So please feel free to rename yourself with your own name. Please do keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking, and use the raise hand feature to ask questions or contribute. We're gonna have a specific Q&A, an interactive part towards the end, where you can ask either the speakers or even other participants questions as well. And please be courteous to all participants and speakers. And if you do have any technical problems, please feel free to message me, this Stephanie Devieri, my CP, privately, and I'll make my best to help you. So thank you so much for following these guidelines. And yeah, I wish a good session to everyone. And now I'm going to pass over the floor to Lauren.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Morning here, so I'm going to be sipping coffee while we engage. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Emily, nice to see you. I'm remembering that I absolutely owe you an email, which is good to remember and to see you. But thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you to Joy and Cosimo and Daniela for being here for this conversation. Before I read your lovely bios, I just want to say that this event on decoloniality and climate mobility, I essentially sat down with Steph and then my ICP team a couple of months ago and started to think about, the role of youth within this space on climate mobility often being a little marginalized at times, a little tokenized at times, and started to question what can we do to spark a conversation around really more meaningful youth involvement, but at the same time understanding that this landscape of addressing climate mobility, of on the one hand problematizing it and kind of coming to understand it through research, at the same time this into thinking about solutions and practical responses to it, often lacks this lens of justice within the mainstream. So we see a lot of kind of emerging conversations on this topic, emerging opportunities in this space, policies developing, laws developing. I think all that's really, really fantastic. And we absolutely should not discredit that work. It needs to be done. It's absolutely vital. For example, like for the sole reason that there isn't protection under international law for someone displaced across borders in the context of climate change today. So we absolutely need to take that work very, very seriously. At the same time, as some of you will know, that includes Stephanie and Joy and Daniela, through the International School on Climate Mobilities as kind of one forum where I've gotten to engage with this topic. There's need to be critical, right, of these spaces, of the context that they exist within, of the mechanisms that we have or that are emerging to kind of understand and address these, I don't even want to call it a challenge after the last ISCM this past year, because maybe that's not the right way to frame it, which I think illuminates also how important the framing really is. So we wanted to organize a conversation around not only what does kind of rights respecting, justice rooted, decolonial approach, what does this look like to climate mobility in terms of understanding it and also responding to the phenomena, but also thinking about this role of youth or young people. I've also been very clear, and I won't go too much into this today, but I've also been really clear in my conversations with the MyCP team that I, in my own work, have been reluctant to use the word youth because I do think it gets tokenized so much. So then the thought came up, how can we start to shift that, right? How can we reclaim the role of youth within this process? And thinking about, in particular, advancing some of these perspectives that often get overlooked, I think, in kind of the mainstreams of climate mobility work. So that's enough from my side. I think that we're well stocked with excellent speakers who can do a better job than I, shining light on some of these. So I'm gonna start with just a quick round of introductions. So we'll just go 1, 2, 3, and we'll start on the left here, with Cosimo. So Cosimo Bianchi is a recent graduate with a master's in advanced migration studies from the University of Copenhagen. Congratulations, just 4 days ago, my understanding, you finished, so congratulations. And he's currently a member of the Climate Mobility team at the Migration, Youth and Children Platform, ICP. His interest in climate-related mobilities and immobilities began during his undergraduate studies in sustainability and development, where he developed a desire to explore this issue from an anthropological and critical perspectives, which is so important. His master's thesis investigated the socioeconomic, political, legal, and infrastructural vulnerabilities contributing to climate-related displacement in Kenya, aiming to understand the issue beyond mere climate hazards. So happy that you're here, Cosimo. I'll keep going, and we'll circle back to you for the first round of questions. So now it's my pleasure to welcome Daniela Alba, who is originally from Bogota, Colombia, a Bocata territory of the Muisca peoples. I hope I'm pronouncing right. Please correct me if I'm not upon your remarks. And currently works in donor relations at the Jesuit Refugee Service, International Office in Rome, Italy. Her journey of displacement to the United States with her family at a young age inspired her career path. She holds a master's degree from the American University of Rome in Peace and Conflict Studies and a bachelor's degree in philosophy with a minor in classics from Brooklyn College at the City University of New York. Before joining JRS, Daniela worked for Oxfam and UNICEF Italia, the Diocese of Brooklyn in New York, and interned at the Consulate General of Italy in New York, as well as the FAO headquarters. She is committed to advocating for access to education, cross-cultural awareness, and against gender-based violence with people who have lived experience of displacement. Daniela, thank you for being here. I'm really looking forward to your contributions and remarks. And last but not least, we have Joy Reyes, who is a climate justice lawyer working with Indigenous peoples and youth climate activists. She is currently the technical advisor of the Climate Center of Manila Observatory, a staff lawyer at Friends of the Earth Philippines, and an occasional research assistant with the Grantham Research Institute working on climate law and evidence. She has co-written articles on climate governance, loss and damage, climate justice, and the intersections between environmental and human rights. She has degrees in psychology, politics, and law, and she has just also finished her master's in global environment, politics, and society at the University of Edinburgh. Congratulations, and thank you for being here as well. Okay, you've heard enough from me. I think if there's any additional kind of introductory remarks, then the three of you are more than welcome to add those. Please feel free. But I'd like to kick us off. We're gonna launch into a roundtable discussion. So the vision for the next hour is that we'll hear from Joy and Cosimo and Daniela on a couple of different questions that we have. We'll do kind of 3 rounds here, and then if we end up in a really critical, engaging conversation amongst the 3 or 4 of us, then we'll kind of go that route. So we're looking to host a bit of a dynamic session. Of course, we're a small enough group too that there's no reason why everyone is not welcome to contribute. Let's all learn together. I think we're all here for a reason, and we'd love to hear a little bit from all of you as we get towards the end of the session about why you're here and why this topic interests you and what reflections come up during the session. So please use the Q&A function as well to share your questions as we go. But for now, we will dive in. So I think I'm going to start with Cosimo, given the order of introductions. You've now been waiting longest. So we'll start with the first question, which is a big one. Why do we need decolonial approaches to understanding and responding to climate mobility or climate-related mobilities or immobilities? Welcome, and over to you, Cosimo.
Thank you so much, first of all, Lauren, and to everyone to have organized this event. It's also for me the first event I participate, especially more as a speaker, but of course I will never define myself as an expert, but more as someone who is very willing to understand the topic of climate-related mobilities and immobilities, especially in the context of decoloniality, but especially I'm very much willing to be very self-critical with myself because, of course, I'm someone who was born in Europe, born in Italy, and has received education more from the West, as also was mentioned before, from the University of Copenhagen, and previously I studied in the Netherlands. So it's important, of course, also for me to kind of like state my positionality because sometimes also difficult to use these terms, and they are also very important, but it's also important to understand that it's important to not overgeneralize when we talk about decoloniality. But I would like to start, of course, to talk about decoloniality, what it means to me, especially in the context of climate mobility and immobility, and especially why it is important to address the decoloniality in the context of climate-related displacement and migration. So decoloniality, of course, refers to the process of dismantling colonial power structures and especially ways of thinking that continue to shape, first of all, our understanding and of climate-related movement, the way we conceptualize it, but especially the way we respond to it. And decoloniality is important because it involves the challenging, especially these dominant Western narratives that we always talk about, but rather it's important to focus on centering the perspective, knowledge, and experiences of marginalized communities, and especially when we refer and we talk about marginalized communities from the global South. The importance to talk about these approaches and these decolonial approaches, and especially in understanding climate mobility, there are different reasons to it. First of all, it's such a niche topic if you think about it, and also like a very recent topic, but it's not necessary. It's not like enough to only talk about the intersection between climate change hazards and mobility and immobility, but we rather have to talk about the systematic issues that rather drive this form of displacement as well as migration. So the important to address decoloniality is to first of all address historical injustices because climate mobility patterns, from what I understood also when I got interested into this topic, are deeply rooted in historical injustices stemming especially from colonialism and capitalism. And these systems, of course, have created some foremost vulnerabilities in the context of mobilities, which need to be addressed. As also Lauren was mentioning before, my master thesis has been very important for me because it helped me to understand the context of climate-related mobilities and immobilities beyond the discourse of climate change hazards, but rather to focus on also the multitude factors which further contribute to this form of displacement of migration. So it's important to, of course, reflect on socioeconomic, political, legal, infrastructure vulnerabilities, but as well as the influence of historical injustices, as well as power imbalances that further contribute to this form of mobility and immobility. Traditional approaches to climate mobility often reinforce existing power structures, and for this reason, we need to be critical with it. And in general, we need to acknowledge that a lot of knowledge that is being created by the global north has a huge influence in the way we conceptualize and the way, especially, we define climate-related migration, displacement, but especially the way we define climate displaced individuals, as well as sometimes climate refugees and climate migrants. But it's important also, and I think we will talk about it probably later, it's important to understand the nuances and the difficulties in conceptualizing also the term climate refugees and climate migrants, and if it's actually always correct, because is it always about understanding climate migration, or we actually have to understand the compounding factors which further contribute to this form of climate migration as well as displacement. What I understood since I engaged within this topic is that we have to understand more in depth, especially because of the policy implications and shortcomings that also Lauren was talking about. We have to understand more in depth the nuances of voluntary migration as well as forced migration or displacement. But it's important, especially from a more decolonial perspective, to understand the various coping and adaptation strategies employed by affected communities in the context of climate change hazards and compounding factors. And it's important to actually understand more these reductive and simplistic Western perspectives in understanding climate mobility, because a critical coming in the current approach is that climate change is not widely recognized, as also mentioned by Lauren, as a form of persecution, especially in the context of climate-related displacement, and especially in some cases also from some intergovernmental organizations. And this has significant implications, which we all have to understand. And of course, the decolonial approach would help us to understand better the implication for legal framework surrounding the refugee status. How can we define a refugee status in the context of climate change hazards, especially when climate change is not widely recognized as a form of persecution? This is a widely and problematic issue that, of course, hides some form of power imbalances as well as forms of colonialism that we need to take into account. And also some implications revolve around the international protection mechanism, also of displaced communities, and the rights and support available to climate displaced individuals. For me, personally speaking, also decoloniality has the purpose to embrace the diverse knowledge systems and also to not always rely on knowledge which is based on Western academia, Western scholars, but also understanding more in depth how, for example, pastoralist communities and indigenous communities understand and conceptualize form of climate-related mobilities and immobilities. And especially we need to acknowledge that the language which is often used by the North is very much different from the global South. And a lot of times, unfortunately, the knowledge from the global North is more enforced and emphasized as also more important in some cases as the more like the summum truth, that we need to take into account. While actually the most impacted individuals are most of the times from the global South. And this is why it's important for the colonial approach to understand not only their first-hand insights, but to understand more in depth, especially from my point of view, the intersectional dimension, which disproportionately affect these communities on a different level, especially when we refer to the discrepancy between the global North and the global South. To kind of like, I don't want to continue for too long, but of course, the colonial lens underscores, of course, also the linkages between climate change, mobility, and broader issues. And it calls for an intersectional understanding of climate-related mobilities and immobilities, recognizing how different communities and individuals are uniquely affected. This approach highlights, for example, how gender, race, class, age, and of course also sexuality and disability intersect to shape different experiences of affected communities. But as you can imagine, if we live in a system that still doesn't acknowledge climate change as a form of persecution on a wider term, it's difficult to understand the different dimensions of intersectionality and how they affect differently communities from different countries as well as individuals within the same communities. We need, of course, to adopt more like the colonial approach to build more inclusive and effective climate justice movements that bridge the discrepancies between the global North and global South. And the solidarity is also crucial for example, reframing mobility, immobility in order to understand more in depth the right to move as well as the right to stay in this context. And to conclude, just because I mentioned a lot of aspects, the colonial approaches are essential for developing more just and equitable and effective responses from my point of view, especially in the context of climate mobility, which is such a niche topic and deserves more attention for a more ethnographic, anthropological, individual perspective. And also the colonial approaches challenge us to confront historical injustices, as I mentioned, reimagining power structure and center the voices and experiences of those most affected by climate change. I am very curious to give the floor more to the other speakers, which I believe can be either Joyce or Daniela, but I'm open also to other questions when we have more discussion.
Wow, Cosimo, thank you so much for kicking us off with all of that. Please never stop preaching is what I want to say. I mean, you really hit a lot of points there, and without going too much into it, like I'm hearing the systemic issues, but also, not only thinking about the kind of mechanisms that we have to address, but really this question of knowledge production and framing and language, right? Which I think in any field of critical studies, we often come back to a lot, but I think that starts to get us to the heart of thinking about decoloniality in the context of climate mobility. There's too much I could say, so I'm going to hold my tongue and I'm going to hand over to Daniela with the same question of why do we need decolonial approaches to understand and respond to climate mobilities?
So thank you so much, first of all, for having me here. It's really an honor. So I just wanted to echo on some points. Yesterday and today, it was Thanksgiving Day in Canada. Today is Indigenous Peoples Days. There is something called Columbus Day that has been celebrated for many, many years by the global minority. And to that, the global majority says that decolonial approaches are essential to the telling of the history that needs to be told and needs to be reframed. So history is usually told by the victors, not by those that are conquered. So those that are conquered are then forced to digest and reproduce within a system of eugenics and a system of power and control while trying to survive. And we can see this right now in Palestine. We can see this in Congo, Sudan. We can see this in Lebanon through the ecocide, the genocide, the upwards oppression, and of course the 400 years that my ancestors and people like such as myself have had to drive through. So last week I was speaking with a friend, and just to humanize the perspective of the fact that most of us have to learn 3 to 4 or 5 languages in order to translate our souls and translate our history for others, as to where in a decolonial approach, others are made to have spaces in which they are comfortable and empowered to make comments about our systems and ways of life. But in reality, our systems and ways of life for hundreds of years was what maintained the earth healthy, what maintained the earth sane, because our relationship to the earth is not one of give and take. It is not based on a utilitarian approach. It is based on a holistic approach of understanding that whatever Mother Earth gives to us, we are supposed to protect. And it is in a reciprocal, unified way that we can respect that she has lived for billions of years before we were even microbes here. So the decolonial approach is really just a kind Western way of taking accountability for the pillaging, for the massacring, and for the upwards upheaval of people's lives that continues today. So in the creation of systems such as the UN, I'm speaking to you from the headquarters of the FAO building. And the reason why I intentionally did that is because we are at the World Food Forum. Meanwhile, we have discussions from people who hold great majority in the global minority, use 90% of our resources, and ask for our knowledge and ask for our resources that we cannot use for our people. There's enough food to go around the world, but we prefer to continue wasting food. We continue to waste the resources. So really the question is not the response to climate mobility has existed for hundreds of years. We were never discovered. We were maintaining relations within our own communities, but also within other indigenous communities and sharing of that. So for example, in the Kingdom of Mali's exchange with the Inca Empire before Columbus decided to make the journey. So really deconstructing the idea that the history that has been shoved down our throats are facts, and that there are not multiple sides. And just because it cannot be read in the English, French, or Spanish language or Portuguese does not mean that it does not exist, that it has not been written about, researched. It does not need to be created. It is there. It is our job to sustain and support the dream of the ancestors, which is to continue giving without asking for anything in return, with the knowledge that those who understand the critical importance of maintaining these traditions alive is to serve the global humanity. It is not to serve ourselves. It is not to center ourselves. It is not to make anyone feel bad. So decoloniality at root is a political term, but in reality is just the humanization of knowledge, the access, the equity that is necessary so that all of us can live together, really, truly at an equity place, not at a place of disadvantage. And as opposed to posing a global majority, global minority, is really to see people's value not as something that serves the chain of capitalism, but that serves something much broader than just policy, academia, the UN systems that were crafted by that same eugenics that has us in the position we are in right now geopolitically. So when it comes to climate mobility, this is very much just the repercussions of hundreds of years of disrespecting and demoralizing the very earth that keeps us as humans alive. So decoloniality only serves as the beginning spark of a long journey of accompaniment to understanding the truths not that have been shoved to us, but that have been granted to us as gifts to cater to the earth so that she can live and be stable the same way that she makes us live and be stable, despite the overwhelming amount of disrespect we give to her. So with that, I'll pass on to Joy. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you, Daniela. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think just picking up on one of your last points there of climate mobility being, more consequential as a result of these legacies, and I often kind of think about it as kind of ruptures and assemblages and that academic discontinuities, right? The continuities, but also what has been discontinued. And I think you've done this wonderful job kind of situating a little bit with that point, this phenomena today within this, broader as kind of a broader consequence, which I think often gets missed in mainstream conversations about climate mobility. So thank you for your reflections. And now I'll hand over to Joy with the same question on why do we need decolonial approaches to understanding and responding to climate mobility. Over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Cosimo and Daniela, for those wonderful reflections. I honestly don't feel like I have much to add, but the fact that I think we need decolonial approaches just because of the fact that mobility is happening. Mobility has been happening. Wherever you are right now is a result of your ancestors or you moving from one place to another. And climate mobility will be happening in the future. And whether it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when, and with the extreme impacts of climate change, it will definitely be happening for each and every one of us. And that's definitely something that we need to keep in mind. And so therefore, when we talk about how to respond to issues such as climate mobility, we cannot repeat the same development pathways that brought us here in the first place. We have to reframe things, we have to rethink how we do things, and we have to rechange and reconceptualize if we want to create a world that is just and that is equitable for all. Otherwise, as again, we're just going to repeat the same patterns that have led us to the destruction that we currently face. And I guess just we need decolonial approaches because simply in the context of the global South-North debate, the harshest impacts of climate change, which includes mobility, are felt by those who are in the peripheries, who have historically been in the margins, who have historically been on the other end of systemic inequalities that come about as a result of colonial legacies. And this is not just colonial legacies from the past. This happens until today. This is not, I think that's why we need to talk about decoloniality, because we cannot just separate the spatial temporalities. Coloniality did not happen 400 years ago. Coloniality happens every day. And so we have to continue to talk to each other and continue to reframe and reconceptualize what we know and what we think we know, so that we're able to create solutions together and respond to the biggest issues that pervades us today. A decolonial approach, like what Cosimo said super exhaustively, means we decenter dominant discourses of immobilities or mobilities. We decenter colonial attitudes and perceptions. We decenter power structures so that we can become not just creative, because creativity is important, but we also become inclusive, we become imaginary, and we become radical in our responses. We don't think about what we know, we think about what we can achieve together. In the Philippines, we're 10% of the population, and this is me kind of echoing what Daniela very eloquently said. Where 10% of the population is indigenous. Indigenous and local communities have had knowledge systems and ways of approaching Mother Earth and the local ecosystems that have made them able to thrive for centuries. And so a decolonial approach values these knowledge systems, brings us back to what matters most, and integrates local knowledge, local experience, local expertise, rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all strategy that comes from a very globalized and often very Western biased framework that is definitely, not just maybe, but is definitely disconnected from lived realities of the people who experience these mobilities in the first place. I also believe that decolonial approaches challenge, what we know as positivistic things like economic structures that drive exploitation, climate vulnerability, etc. This also includes questioning industries, questioning what we mean when we say development, questioning what sustainability means for us. All of these things. This means coming into or presenting yourself in decision-making tables and really questioning the terms themselves, not because they're wrong, but because sometimes we might have been understanding them differently in a way that is disconnected from the people that will need the help that we might be able to provide for them. Decolonial perspectives reveal the connections of extractive industries and climate impacts. And they also advocate for power and agency in affected communities rather than leaving decisions to distant policymakers who, again, may not know what's happening on the ground. I feel like, or I believe that a decolonial perspective, a decolonial approach is more than just a perspective, right? It's an essential reframing. It's an essential shift towards justice and equity in climate mobility and climate immobility. Here is where we argue for, like what Daniela said, a reparative approach to Mother Earth, to nature, to climate justice, one that repairs rather than destroys and integrates rather than isolates. And I think it's really just for people might sometimes, I feel, get bogged by the technical definitions of stuff, but I think I will always echo what Daniela said, that really decoloniality is coming back to your roots. Decoloniality is coming back to nature, to Mother Earth, and to the realization that we are not alone in this. The point is we are in here together, and we need to work together to approach that. We need to question our biases, our perspectives. We need to understand our positionality. We need to be reminded of where we want to go, and the fact that we might need to question things that we know now, and unlearn things and learn things and relearn things. And maybe that's what decoloniality is all about.
Wow, you're giving me so much energy. Actually, all three of you. Thank you, Joy, for your remarks. One of the very first things you said when you started speaking is that mobility is nothing new, right? And I was at a workshop last week, and I asked everyone in the room to raise their hand if they don't live in the area where they were born. And I think almost every person in that room, actually, except for me, for once in my adult life, raised their hand. And I think, there's a question around, there's a lot to be said and unpacked around like what gets normalized, right, versus what reality actually reflects, right? Like these dominant discourses, like mobility is this unnatural thing, close the borders, and all of the backlash that comes of that, like contrasted with the reality of everyday life. And I think that's part of this project too, of centering centering of decolonial, like in a way, I would add, to answer my own question for you all, I would add that decolonial approaches to climate mobility are they have to be about ground truthing, like what is really going on the ground, right? And let's tell the truth of that story, and let's be aware of who's telling that story and how we're framing that story. I could go on, but for the sake of time, we'll go to the second round. So Cosimo, we'll come back to you, and I've got kind of a question that builds on the previous one, but also feel free to reflect on anything that's been said so far. But the second question is, what does climate mobility justice mean to you, and why, in your opinion, is the collective power of young people important to advance rights respecting, justice rooted in decolonial approaches to, on the one hand, understanding this phenomena of climate related mobilities and mobilities, and then also responding to it. So again, to simplify, what does climate mobility justice mean to you, and kind of what's the role of young people in advancing some of these shifts that we're illuminating here throughout your responses. So over to you, Cosimo.
Thank you so much, Lauren. This question is, of course, maybe can be more practical, or it can also still be more ideological. I love the answers from Daniela and Joy, because, of course, I fully echo and support what they say, especially in regards to the aspect of still relying on the different frameworks that are prioritizing economic growth as a form of paradigm, but especially they are prioritizing the knowledge that has been delivered and has been shaped by intergovernmental organizations. It doesn't mean that the same knowledge which has been shaped by these big institutional organizations that we have to take for granted and we have to take it as a kind of summum truth, as the main knowledge that we have to take into account. For me, climate mobility justice then doesn't only represent a critical and more like holistic approach to addressing the complex interplay between climate change and human movement, but for me, sometimes in also very simple terms, is about social anger. I think sometimes we really have to acknowledge as the youth. I think the more we get older, and the more we also realize how much the older generations and as well as um, have shaped a different way of living life, and especially like understanding simply also the working life, you know. And we still rely on these forms of economic growth paradigms, which to a certain extent will never allow us to fully focus on the rights, especially in the needs of marginalized communities. This is because I think one of the biggest issues that I've faced when I was more like reflecting, especially of the concept of climate mobility justice, is that if we still rely on more colonial approaches in the context of climate mobilities and immobilities, especially if you think about this ongoing interconnection between securitization and climate mobilities and immobilities, for me, is a very problematic issues that we need to take into account, and especially us as like youth members, as like a collective, we need to reflect on why there is this ongoing debate on reflecting on securitization in the context of climate mobilities and immobilities, and why especially the West and the global North is trying to enforce this narrative to kind of course, limit these movements, but rather than limiting these movements is, of course, to rather enforce the barriers and especially enforce this idea of not including, and especially within like destination countries and welcoming within destination countries migrants and refugees, as well as asylum seekers, which are affected in the context of climate change hazards and environmental factors. To me, I think since I come from more like an anthropological background, one of the first debates, one of the first discussion we had in the context of climate related displacement and migration was about this aspect of securitization. But as youth members, as also was kind of, as both like Daniela and Joy were talking about, we need to reflect on the language. And sometimes something that I reflect since the beginning, and especially regarding indigenous communities, as it's also been mentioned by Daniela, we need to reflect on this feticization aspect, which is very problematic when we reflect especially on indigenous communities, but also pastoralist communities. With fetishization aspect, I mean that sometimes we really tend also to just simply victimize affected communities in the context of climate change hazards, but without reflecting on their form of resilience and their form of resistance, and to what extent their form of resistance can also be perceived as a form of social transformation that we need to take into account, rather than always focusing on these innovation mechanisms and solutions that are often portrayed by Western countries, for example. And I think also more as when I reflect about colonial justice and rather colonial justice, I reflect about climate mobility justice. I think it's very much important to I simply reflect on our role as like youth members. And when I started engaging for the first time, especially, of course, I come from the Western world, the first movements related to climate change in general were more focusing about Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion. But I think still nowadays it's still visible to see how also these movements have become more critical within themselves as well. And of course, we also still need to be critical when we engage within these movements, because in some cases also these movements also engage within the Western world. But as also Daniela was mentioning, now we don't only talk about ecocide, we also talk about Palestinian resistance within the environmental justice movement. So we understand how much the youth is becoming more critical, and especially, as I also mentioned before, when we reflect about intersectionality, we cannot only talk about ecological issues, we need to go beyond socioeconomic and political legal structures. And who more than the youth is willing to especially engage within these topics. I think when I reflect about myself and sometimes also my my development in the education field, I think about the first time I engaged within the sustainable development sector, and sometimes also when I first engaged within the so-called sustainable development goals. For me, it was actually oftentimes very problematic when we reflect on the SDG economic growth paradigm. And I think it came quickly to me to reflect on after 1 or 2 years, especially after a few months of the beginning of my bachelor's, to be like, to what extent actually these development related goals are relying on some sort of Western standards, and which are also the problematic issues to it if we still rely on some form of economic growth paradigms. Because whenever we reflect on destination countries, there is still this enforcement about focusing on securitization as well as the economic benefits of the destination country, rather than actually focusing on implementing decolonial approaches and focusing on marginalized communities and especially their needs. So for me, personally speaking, when I think about the role of the collective dimension of youth movements in this field, it is about actually going beyond the concept of development, going beyond economic growth paradigm, going beyond this aspect of securitization. If we continue to do this, I don't know to what extent actually we're going to talk about marginalized communities, we're going to talk about their rights. And for me, I think still of course I'm a Western student. I'm not a Western researcher, but I'm a student that is engaged within Western academia. And I still, of course, when I look back at a few years ago, I don't want to say I feel ashamed about some of the aspects that also been educated to myself to believe in. And I think that's why we have the role as youth to not always take for granted that a professor necessarily as the right view to reflect on sustainability. Sustainability, decoloniality is conceptually and realistically also perceived differently from all of us. And it's important for us to engage, especially in forms of transnational coalitions and especially transnational forms of transnational platforms which allow us to raise awareness on this topic, because as also has been mentioned by the other speakers, the main issue is still conceptual. It's still, we still don't know how to define sometimes climate migrants. Is it correct to use this term? And I think it is potentially not correct to a certain extent, but are we using the same language, and to what extent is important to use the same language? I think sometimes using this more sophisticated and philosophical way of thinking can be problematic because we use a different language, but it can also help us to better understand what are the systematic issues that we need to face as also youth movements, in order to better understand also how to implement more effectively policies that are more linked to understanding the rights of marginalized communities rather than the benefits of the destination countries in the context of climate-related mobilities and immobilities. And I think I will pass the word to Daniela or Joy, whenever.
Actually, I'll jump in for a moment here. Thank you, Cosimo. That was great. While you were speaking, I had this vision of young people in the streets all over the world holding signs calling for system change, not climate change. Really, like that was kind of the visual, right? For the sake of time, we'll just bump on over to Daniela. So the same question, what does climate mobility justice mean to you? And in your opinion, why is the collective power of young people so important in advancing this kind of rights-respecting, justice-oriented decolonial approaches to understanding and responding to climate-related mobilities and immobilities? Over to you.
Thank you. So I just want to focus in on a couple of things. The first one being that the first climate movements are not something that were born in the West, because the inherent existence of indigenous and pre-societal civilization, Western civilization communities were the first collective movements. And they left those traces behind. Whatever wasn't burnt to the ground still remains in our native tongues. And so it's really, I think, the first thing that I can say goes to speak of climate mobility justice is to have the uncomfortable conversations of not asking people to continue to be resilient. Stop normalizing violence towards us. Stop making it something that is normalized and that is propagated as, oh, that happens in those parts of the world. What's happening in Palestine right now, what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, it is not normal. It is not to be normalized, because at the core value, the issue is not even academic, political, law, social. It comes down to the human component. Are you convinced that you and I hold the same value as humans, or do you see me as disposable and as something that you can stand to live without the minute that I stop doing what you want me to do? Point blank. There is no if, ands, or buts. If we do not start from that, you are then categorically and imperatively refusing to acknowledge my humanity. And within that humanity, you are also reducing me to my ability to survive everything that is stacked against me. So for example, trying to justify or to say, well, we can't just change the system. We can't start from scratch. No, we did it once. We can do it again, and we can do it without normalizing extreme forms of violence and extreme levels of dehumanization and of ravaging and pillaging. We can do that. We have the ability to do that. We've done it before. We can do it again. And I think those conversations need to be had before we start empowering people and asking them to continue being resilient. I shouldn't have to be resilient if your entire existence is propped up on me not having the very basic needs so that you can sustain your life in the global minority. You do not believe in my humanity at face value. That is at the very basis of this conversation. People are not ready to hear it. We rather watch a live stream genocide, people being burned alive, rather than acknowledge that we are watching is not only normalized by the global minority, but that we turn it into a spectacle. And what does that have to do with the environment? Everything. It really all comes down to the fact that this is everything. If we cannot start with that, what does that say about our ability to also then say climate mobility, whether it is immobility, whether it is climate related or climate induced, has to do with the inequities of having to spend your entire life surviving and not existing. Let that sink in. Surviving, not existing, not being able to continue to grow on your traditional knowledges. As Indigenous youth, we are tired of having to continue to educate people on us. We are also tired of empowering youth from the global minority to speak for us, because that is also a tool of appropriation. That is also a tool of gentrification, of climate justice and climate-related knowledge spaces, but then also of having to continuously, again, the translation, yes, language matters, Cosimo was saying this, of having to continue translating our ways of life and what has worked in the past and what continues to work. So the Amazon is burning to the ground as we speak. It has been for decades. The lungs of the earth that my ancestors fought with their own lives to protect on their territories. Why are we not speaking about this? Why is this not being? And so when Lauren says, I have this image of people going to the streets, we have been going to the streets for almost a year now, decrying the misuse of land by colonial settlers all over the globe in different instances, but most importantly, highlighted in the West Bank and in Gaza. And we see this flattening, literal flattening. And we ask ourselves, where is this collective power? Because then when it comes to young people and it comes to certain spaces, we are also used as tools to say, see, we fit a quota. We have these young people coming to speak wherever they are from in the sector, but we don't really want to listen to whatever they have to say. So we give them the platform, they're the last to speak. We give them the platform, they don't have any follow-ups from any sort of policy, law, governmental NGOs, but they want the pictures. But they want us to wear Indigenous garb, but they want us to show up and say hi and smile and wave. But this is not a zoo, and this is not a museum for your visual pleasure. And so I really think at the very beginning of this entire conversation is saying, no, I am a forcibly displaced person. I can call out my own privilege and say I took a plane and probably increase my carbon footprint when escaping the war that was incited by the US in my country in the 90s. But I do not know what it is like to physically walk by foot with everything I know and love on my back and on my shoulders through the Darien Gap, which is one of the most dangerous passages on Earth, to try to survive to try to achieve and to try to obtain what has been consistently stolen from me. So until we have, even within our own forcibly displaced communities, the hard conversations about our access, privilege, and how we either assimilate or integrate into our host nations, when we see the resistance of immobilities, do not amplify the resilience that it takes to sustain that, but rather call out the systems that force people to continuously be resilient, that force them to stay in that system. That's what we need to do. That's what justice really looks like, because at face value, it is driven by a deep love, not by anger, because anger has been also used against us. We're not allowed to be angry. We're not allowed to say anything. We're not allowed to complain because it is seen as savagery. It is not savagery. You can be angry and hold love for the people that are willing to walk with you on that journey. So I guess what I'm trying to say is climate justice looks like anger in the form of love, in the form of having the difficult conversations and of empowering one another to truly walk that path at every single level and destroy what has been built and rebuilt it again together. I repeat that, destroy the entire system of what has been built. There is no reform. We are beyond that. If this moment hasn't taught us that, I don't know what will. So I'll pass that back on to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Daniela. I'm speechless, so I'm just gonna hand to Joy. She was snapping. I mean, obviously has a lot to add, but thank you. Then Joy, over to you.
I don't have much to add because that was, I am so glad that I was muted this entire time because I was just like, yes, Daniela, speak words to action, truth to action. That is, yeah, we really do need to have uncomfortable conversations. And I guess that is the end all and be all of all of this, right? Just like being able to find spaces, pockets of spaces, this Zoom meeting, for instance, where we're able to like sit in front of each other and question what we know and question what we don't, and maybe learn and relearn from others, from other people. And so I think, and maybe I'm still so emotional because I really hate the word resilience. Like, I'm Filipino, I hate the word resilience. You know those photos of like whenever there's a typhoon, when Typhoon Haiyan struck the country in 2013, many news sites have all said like, oh, the resilience of the Filipino spirit. You see Filipinos like doing karaoke in the midst of like all of these, like in the midst of knee-high or waist-high floodwaters. And it's just been co-opted so much that it's then become a reason for inaction and indifference by governments who should be doing something, but who has then created sort of an individualistic approach to climate action because people can do it by themselves. Why do governments need to step in, etc.? And it's so frustrating. And then you see the fact that the Philippines, well, just last week, the reports came out that the Philippines, for the 11th year in a row, has been the most dangerous country in the world for land and environmental defenders. And on top of that list as well are countries like Colombia, Brazil, etc. And then we think to ourselves, we cannot be resilient because people's lives are not up for debate. How are we having discussions in like these hallowed halls, deciding whether or not some things should be given, such as, I don't know, climate discussions, human rights discussions? Why are we having these conversations? Human rights are not up for debate. My life is not up for debate. My future is not up for debate. I deserve to live a life by virtue of my being born, to live a life of dignity and to live a life where I can fulfill what I want to do and in a way that is not hurtful or harmful to everyone, in a way that is nurturing, in a way that is dignified. So sorry, I'm just maybe going off on a tangent because Daniela's words were really, really strong. And it, again, as I said earlier, this discussions of coloniality, it's not discussions from 400 years ago. It's not discussions from when Spain went to the Philippines in the 1500s. It's discussions from 1948. It's discussions from last year. It's discussions from every day that we wake up and we realize that many other people are suffering because of settler colonialism, because we think that we somehow have rights over land. And so I think, okay, I'm going back a little bit, but I think, and this is coming from my perspective as a climate justice lawyer, that climate mobility justice means like what Daniela said, it's and Cosimo, the wide array of justice issues that revolve around climate mobility, obviously, and creating an understanding on the causes of climate mobility and immobility, the expressions of climate mobility and inability, and the way we respond to climate mobility and immobility, especially in a world that is increasingly facing climate extremes. And so, like what Daniela said, climate mobility justice, as in climate justice, is a continuous reckoning. It's a continuous cycle of asking ourselves, who do we center? Whose voices do we amplify? Who do we forget? Whose lives do we put up for debate? Who are we appropriating solutions? Are we co-opting responses, or are we actually doing this together? And as in climate justice in general, climate mobility justice looks at the interconnectedness of struggles and understanding not just the shallow whys, but actually looking at systemic reasons for why we're here and why we need to dismantle the current systems in place in order to create a better world. It gives us space to confront the ways in which we, again, define things, and how we make our decisions. And then there was mention earlier of love, there's mention of anger. And here I'm also going to talk about climate affect. I'm going to talk about the fact that climate mobility justice is definitely about love for the planet, for each other, for the future that we all collectively want to create. It's about anger as well. But I think, and especially with collective power of youth, I think it's about joy. It's about finding resistance together, finding spaces. It's joy is not happiness. Joy is not, I'm sorry, I keep mentioning my name. Joy is not just this one-off emotion, right? It's realizing that everything is through space-time. It's not always celebration. It's not always victories. It's not always successes. I think joy is also realizing that there is deep, deep sadness. There is deep, deep discomfort. There's deep, deep hurt. But there is always collective solidarity. There's always collective work to be done. And I guess on a more practical level, I do believe that young people hold a unique and critical role in the climate mobility justice movement, as well as in the climate justice movement as a whole. We are not only, and by we, I mean very tangentially, we are not only the generation that is most affected by climate change, but we are also the ones with, I guess, the most passion, the most creativity, the most to lose, and the most to offer. And we have the strongest, I like to believe, moral drive to push for meaningful action. And we know that our voices matter. And we know that things aren't working right now. And so we need to remind ourselves, each other, not just of the fact that that a better future is possible, but that it can happen in our lifetimes. And that is something that we've been continually holding on to. And it's difficult. I mean, that's not up for debate. But the truth is, I think youth, we just were able to ask ourselves the difficult questions that Daniela said. And very rarely, I think this was just 2 years ago, when in one of the COPs, when a group of French youth climate activists came up to me and then they said, what can youth from the global north do? And honestly, maybe a decade ago, that would not have been a question that would have been normalized in conversations. We would not have been able to have difficult conversations like that, where I know my privilege, what can I do to help you amplify your voice? And I guess, like, just learning that, just realizing the sheer amount of power that we have collectively is so amazing. And yeah, like, it's a shared experience that binds us. We know it's going to happen to us. We know we need to do something now. And it's this unity that gives us the power to demand, as well as create, a right-centered, justice-rooted change. So thank you.
Wow, you hit me again. Thank you. Just so phenomenal to have all three of your insights and reflections. And I, as someone who deeply loves love, am so happy that that has surfaced as part of this conversation. I have a quote from you, Joy, written here: climate mobility justice is about love and joy. And I think that's incredible. when I started working in the human rights space, I was always asked the question, why did you decide to work on human rights? And the answer was because I love all 8 billion people on the planet and the planet herself. And, it's like such an unconventional, unspoken of aspect of this work. And, I think the more we talk about it, the more we're again kind of being, in some instances, honest with ourselves about why we're here and what we're doing. I have one last round of questions, and I do want to ask, even though we're a bit over in time, and so we'll kind of do this last round, and then we'll open up for more of a discussion. Maybe if you can keep your responses to more like 4 or 5 minutes instead of 7. But there's so much passion, so I won't blame you. I won't blame you if you go over. But this is, to me, a little bit of the most daunting question, and I'd be curious to hear if that feels like your experiences too. But this third question is kind of how can we ensure that everything we're talking about right now, these decolonial and justice-centered and rights-respecting approaches, are not just part of a dialogue that, on the one hand is sidelined to academic marginal spaces, right? But that actually get implemented at policy levels. And I think we can say law or policy spaces or development, programming, finance, right? I mean, we can really extend. We know that climate mobility is cutting across all of these sectors and issue areas. But just thinking about those spaces, and I know, I mean, even, my very focus on climate mobility justice in my work comes from working in climate mobility spaces and seeing the absence of the conversation we're having here, right? I mean, this is absolutely the inspiration to my work. And I, not to shamelessly plug too much here, but I'm in the process of launching a new nonprofit organization called the Beyond Climate Collaborative. And I think Cosimo said, we need to be beyond these systems and structures. And that's where the word beyond is coming from, right? Like we really need to start centering everything that you guys are saying here. And I mean, the energy that we all feel, I can see the chat, right? I know that we're feeling these words, right? And this exchange of energy, I often joke in my work that my compensation is not always financial for my work, but it's the exchange of energy, right? That I get from the people I get to work with and have these really, really evocative and encouraging conversations. But the question that, again, I always find really daunting, but I'm trying, every day right now to think, how can I operationalize this, right? How can we take all that we're talking about and this kind of collective power and energy and these visions we're discussing and channel them, into action? And I'll leave it to all three of you to decide if you want to reflect specifically on what that means for policy or what that means, maybe Joy, in your case, for legal protection, or if, the answer is maybe thinking about different mechanisms beyond policies and beyond legal protection. Maybe it's not just a matter of plugging these ideas into the existing systems, but reimagining these systems. And maybe it's a balance between the two, and maybe there's a lot of work to be done in every single kind of entry point, across. But I mean, yeah, kind of the broader question, really, how can we ensure that these conversations we're having right now lead to action, wherever that may be that you want to speak to? So Cosimo, I'll hand back over to you to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you so much also to join Daniela. I'm incredibly inspired. And I have to say that also this is the most difficult question, because I think this is also the question which, to a certain extent, is a bit more distanced from my way of thinking, because maybe coming from also this more anthropological background, I tend to think very ideologically sometimes, and I also tend to, a certain extent, also dislike myself also to always reflect in these regards, because it's a bit difficult also sometimes when you actually come across the real world actually wants you to reflect on policies and actually practical actions to a certain extent. But I think I will still start to reflect on this question from a more ideological point of view. And I think, what if to a certain extent all of us, but especially speaking from my side and speaking from a more Western perspective, which I have to acknowledge, if we start actually seeing policy not always as this effective implementation, but to a certain extent, what if actually the term policy hides a form of legal violence to a certain extent? I think a lot of times actually all of us do not reflect on the term on the term policy, and a lot of times policy is seen as also in this case as what is actually correct. I think because sometimes it's like this is on a policy level, what is correct, what is written down on a legal and bureaucratic perspective, this is what we have to follow. And a lot of times, actually, the term legal violence for me is one of the most, in a most simple way, represents a lot of times the term policy because there are a lot of aspects that we sometimes do not reflect on, which is like what is legal is never and is not often associated to something that is justice. And to a certain extent, then we have to reflect on then like is legal actually justice, or to a certain extent is legal a form of violence? And I think when I engage within this form of and I'm sorry if sometimes I keep this more ideological way of thinking, but to me a lot of times on a more practical level it's difficult to I think sometimes if we start reflecting on the other way around, not to start reflecting on which are the effective policies that we have to put in place, but rather which are the effective solutions to kind of distance ourselves to a form of legal violence. I hope you're kind of like understanding to what my direction of thinking. And a lot of times also these policies and on a more practical level, these policies, of course, as I mentioned before, are still linked to some form of securitization. These policies are still wrong, and I'm no one, and I'm not a scholar in this field that can say what is the correct term to reflect on. But it's also sometimes when I was kind of reflecting on what Daniela and Joy, they were both saying, we don't necessarily need to reflect probably on the most accurate term, but actually we need to reflect on what is the human dimension of climate mobility rather than actually always referring, and this is a kind of way of thinking from the West to always, which of course this we distance ourselves from a more decolonial approach because we always need to categorize. And after the categorization, we can actually have a more effective policies. But in this way of thinking, to what extent we still enforce a form of legal violence? And I think I hope you are kind of understanding what I mean. And if I try to actually respond to this question on a more practical level, of course, I believe, strongly believe that the more we collect, of course, different insights, different not only declarations or consultations from you from different countries, but also from different communities, and we also enforce some forms of intersectionalities, and we reflect on what does it mean intersectionality in the context of both legal violence and also public policy and private policy to a certain extent. So I think this is the only way to a certain extent to collect, and the only way, practically speaking, to collect different insights. And the solution to a certain extent is to kind of reflect on also ways to not emphasize certain insights rather than others. Of course, I believe that we, as a Western a person, I believe that actually if we believe and we try to enforce more insights also from the global South, if we also try to enforce more insights from marginalized communities, we will tend to also more critically engage with our way of conceptualizing climate mobility, but especially the intersection between climate mobility policy and especially legal violence. I don't know if also Joy and Daniela would like to reflect on this concept of legal violence, or we will talk about it in the discussion session, but this is one of the most important aspects for me when I reflect about policy, that probably I'm too critical with it, and I don't strongly believe a lot of times in policy implementations, especially if we reflect that policy implementations often come from top-down approaches and from also intergovernmental organizations, which are still relying on paradigms from the West, and as I said before, securitization and economic growth paradigm. So I leave the floor to these amazing speakers that know a lot, know a lot about this.
Thank you, Cosimo. I'm so grateful to you for shining light on legal violence in the context of this conversation. I think in your initial remarks, you were really shining light on epistemic violence. I think Daniela has raised genocidal and ecocidal forms of violence. I think as we think across these different overlapping, intersecting systems and structures, we can see that, you know, there is this Joy, you're making this face like something's wrong. Is something wrong?
No,
We
just
got an
Like, am I
amazing
missing something?
sorry.
we got an amazing comment here in the chat.
So cool.
Ah,
Yeah, I'm gonna read it out. So Malak said that
okay.
she wanted to share something she's really amazed about, and what a coincidence. It is the first time she sees Daniela, but it is unbelievable that she's the same woman that she chose to paint with other women in her mural in Portugal, which is about the women from different nationalities, the women who have been persecuted in their lives. That's so amazing. Please do share a picture with us if you have so. We would love to see that.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm really amazed, but I want to ask Daniela first from where she is, because the woman that I paint, one of the 6 women, she's from the original American people, the Indian people, they were live in America. So this is the nationality, but she seems, really seems, it seems to her. So that's why when I see her, I amazed how can I believe that I saw the moment that I like imaginally choose it to paint. Wait a second, a moment, I will share the mural.
I think in the meantime, maybe Daniela can continue. But yeah, that's amazing, Malak. Thank you so much for sharing. That's super exciting.
Daniela, do you want to say anything before we dive back into the panel, or should I just hand over to you anyway? Because really, you're up next anyway.
So I'm really shocked, you know, like I'm trying to take it in. It's an honor. Yes, I'm from Colombia. I'm from what is now known as Bogotá. Well, it's now Bogotá, the capital of Colombia. And yes, we are the Muisca people, who are a pre-Incan tribe. Currently, we are less than 0.05% of the population of the country. So it's very moving to think that, you know, someone could, you know, keep memorialize that, because unfortunately we are decreasing. So that's very moving. So first I want to just say, like, obviously, Cosimo, going to what you were saying, I think that it's extremely valuable that we all use our gifts and our talents and our positionality and our reach to do what we can across different places. We're no longer at a point of moral sainthood. The concept by Susan Wolf that preaches that just one person, like the Nelson Mandela effect, you know, the Gandhi effect, we're beyond that, you know? So really, when we're talking about doing something together, it is really something that comes from you using that position within the West, having those reaches into certain spaces where maybe I'm not going to be, but you and I are carrying that energy forward together. And so you're speaking about policy and law, and that's extremely important within the spaces that you occupy and you work in. And so it's not about like, okay, your work means less, mine means more. It's just we're working in different spaces because we hold that devotion to the collective care that has to be done, you know, in the spaces that we have access to and the spaces that we can contribute to, while also then meeting each other somewhere in that intersection to share with each other best practices, best ways, and really pushing one another. Sometimes when we feel depleted, you know, when we say, when the elders speak about rest as resistance, we use a process within the National Organization of Colombian indigenous peoples, where we do a process called mambiar, which means basically in English that you sit together and you just go around in a circle and you pass the word on, and you're just sharing. You're sharing knowledge. You're sharing it as a form of resistance, but also as a form of deep rest. I have been privileged to witness this in communities of forcibly displaced people, in different places and different spaces, but the most recent in Baalbek in Lebanon. And it's in the camps of displaced Syrian peoples who are living amongst the communities of Lebanese peoples, but also Palestinian refugees from the previous expulsions. And you see this sharing, you see this gathering. because it is a form also of saying, you may want to tear us apart, but we will join together. We will see each other. We will meet each other halfway. So when I look at this question and just at a face value from my perspective, is to really listen to my elders to make sure that their memories, their knowledge continues on, that it is able to be immemorialized for time to come, for other generations to reap from, even when I myself, you are gone. That is a very deep truth, but that's also a very deep privilege to be able to do that work. So also hold gratitude for the ability to speak several languages, to have an education. So just these very little things that add up and really counting every step forward. And in each of our spaces, each of us occupy different spaces within the NGO world, within our own like specializations, within where we focus on, and really holding each other and propping up together. And when one of us is like, I'm really exhausted, depleted, propping up the other one to be like, continue with me, like passing on the baton and continuing the race. So that's, yes, I'll pass that back on to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Daniela. Did we? Okay, Malik is sharing screen, so. Malik, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to speak about what you're showing us.
Yes, the first woman next to me. Yes, she's the original American woman, and in my opinion, she's similar to Daniela, because I kept in mind when I choose her to choose, as she said, to memorize these people. I don't want anyone in the world that who was how to say, to under the violence, to be forgotten. That's why I let these women in the mural to be remarkable. One of them from North American, from Portugal, from Asia. The one she's wearing hijab, she's from Palestine, Indian woman, and the one she's in the right, she's from Africa. The woman, she struggled until now in her life.
Thank you for sharing this. So this is in Portugal, and you must be an artist there. Will you tell us a little bit about your work, and maybe if you want to share more information on where to find you? I'm sure we would love to have that information in the chat.
I was in an Erasmus volunteer in Portugal for 7 months, and I was working as an artist with the kids and with the women. They have mental problem health, and yes, this was my last project in the organization, to paint on one of its wall, and I choose this topic to talk about it because I am always with the women. They were under violence, and they are struggling in their life. So I want them to be remarkable in the beautiful way, with their traditions, with their customs. And yes, this is why was my last project in Portugal. Thank you for all.
Thank you for sharing with us, and thanks for the work that you're creating. It's amazing how much can be captured in a piece of art versus an academic paper, but I didn't actually say that. Of course, all the mediums are important, but I think the emotional provocation of what you're creating, has what I would say a layer of transcendence that can bring us to that place of love and joy, as Joy was talking about. So thank you for the work you're doing, but also for sharing it with us. Again, please feel free to put a link to your work or anything within the chat, in case anyone wants to follow all that you're doing. I will hand over to Joy for kind of the last word on this question of thinking about action in the context of this conversation, and then from there we'll open up the floor for a discussion. Friendly reminder, you're welcome to put questions in the chat, but also very encouraged to unmute and come on and join into a conversation with us. So last but not least, Joy, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Malak. That was beautiful. I think just I think the first thing to remind ourselves is that these are not just conversations. These are conversations and these matter. And so conversations like these are a good first start. Finding spaces that are safe, where discussions can be had in a way that is nurturing, in a way that you learn from each other is always great. And with regard to like policy making, I guess in the international level, the truth is we can't always find ourselves in these decision making rooms. And that is just the truth of the matter. That sometimes is a matter of privilege, that sometimes is a matter of education, sometimes of influence, sometimes a matter of wealth, sometimes even just the circumstances of your birth, like where you were born and the kinds of privileges that came with those spatiotemporal realities. So the truth is, the harsh truth is, we might not be able to get into those spaces. However, what that does is lay down the context of our ability, but it does not limit the impact of our reach. And it's the impact of our reach that matters most anyway. And so while part of the movement is making sure we get a seat at decision-making tables, ideally, it also means making sure that we amplify each other's voices. We hold each other not just in solidarity, but also accountable to each other. We are accountable to each other. We are accountable to the words that we say, to the actions that we make. And it means being aware of your positionality. I guess it just really comes back to what we have been discussing from the very beginning. And on a practical level, and again, I guess I'm putting on my climate lawyer hat, it means engaging in discourse, using your talents. There is like an academic paper would have massive reach, but that painting by Malak will reach even more people who might not be able to understand or have access to an academic paper that is covered by a paywall, you know? Using your talents, whether it be in art, in networking, in fundraising, in order to get the word out. It means on also a local level, and we do this in the Philippines, writing to your local politicians so that they are made aware of what they owe their constituents. It means attending events where people can see that we not just have the drive, but we have the number, and that's important. It means being in this virtual room right now where we're having these difficult conversations and questioning what you think you know, and sharing what your thoughts are. And possibly it's also it means legal action as well. And like what Cosimo said, sometimes when it's a positivist thing, when it comes with the fact that these are all Western creations, it can be really difficult, but it's also important to get the word out. And in the last decade, just in the last decade, youth movements have been visionary, have been leaders in the legal discussions on climate. We have Sharma in Australia. We have Neubauer in Germany. We have Larose versus Majesty the King. There are hundreds. There's Japan right now. There's plenty discussions. And I am sure there'll be many more. It also means following through, right? It means ongoing monitoring, ongoing keeping ourselves, and not just ourselves, not just our friends, but also those in government accountable. It means keeping ourselves in check. And it also means collaborating with other people, even those we have not worked yet, because we know we will be listening to them. And again, I do feel like every time Daniela speaks, I'm like, this is what I was going to talk about. But it's great because I do feel like we are kindred spirits. But I guess it's also knowing that the work we do is important, but that the decolonial approach to justice also means that exactly rest is resistance. The exploitative, capitalist, colonialist world wants us to work ourselves to the ground and forget ourselves and forget what we're here for and forget each other. But what we want is something that will last far beyond us, far beyond our children. We want something that will continue and be sustainable. And so if we take ourselves and if we take care of ourselves and if we take care of each other, we can go beyond advocating for short-term fixes. And maybe that's how we create a better world. Maybe it's in taking care of ourselves. Maybe it's in taking care of each other. Maybe it's in holding each other's hand that we can continue to remind ourselves that this is not something we're fighting for now. We're fighting for the future. We're fighting for our grandchildren. We're fighting for the grandchildren of our grandchildren. And I guess that's how we build a foundation for something that is rights respecting and justice rooted. And together, I guess this is how we create the world where climate mobility isn't a forced decision, but is one that respects the dignity and rights of every person, and one that is upholding of their human rights. And I guess I guess just to end, I was rewatching The Good Place, which is one of my favorite shows. And then there was this part there where they were talking about what we owe each other. And you know, the colonialist capitalist world wants you to think that you owe no one anything. That is not true. You owe people, you owe the farmers your gratitude. You owe them to live a life. You owe them a life of dignity. You owe them to work with them to create a world that is beautiful. And towards the end, there was a time where the main characters had like they had a problem facing them. And then Kristen Bell, who is one of the main characters, she was like, I think we have one move left. We can try. And I guess that's just what we can do. We can try. We can try with each other. We can try to take care of ourselves. We can try to take care of one another. We can try to take care of planet Earth. And I don't know if it'll work in this lifetime, but for sure the work will continue. And I guess that's the joy in it. That's the beauty in it, that it does not end. And that's what we need to be thinking about anyways. Like, let's not talk about what is now. We need to talk about how we can make this work for everyone in the future, because there is no time. There is just this planet, and all we have is each other. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for the powerful remarks to close us off with our kind of roundtable discussion, round 3 rounds, if you will. Thank you to all 3 of you, really, Cosimo, Daniela, Joy. Just wonderful to hear your insights. Still feeling very, very energized and excited to hear from everyone. I do want to share one thing. I can't help myself. I totally said to all of you that I wouldn't talk about my new organization that I've been in the process of launching, but I want to make just this one simple point. When I started to look at this landscape of climate mobility and think about, kind of map the stakeholders, who's working on this and what approaches are they taking, where are the gaps and what can I do, where can my add value be within this? It was very clear that considerations of justice are, as I've said, quite absent in the mainstream conversation. So I spent a while thinking maybe I'll work within the system, if you will. Maybe I'll work for these NGOs and try to, provoke them to be more critical and more rights respecting and justice based and decolonial within their approaches. That can work sometimes. It's really important. That work is vital. I think that we need all hands on deck, right? Working within and outside of the systems as best we can. But I became quite burnt out, and burnout is very real in this work, right? And I think, as you just said, Joy, rest is resistance, right? I mean, I think acknowledging that burnout and being responsive to it is vital. But I started to question, well, some spaces I enter, the ISCM would be one of them, I am energized when I walk away, as opposed to having the energy sucked out of me, right? And so I started to think, what can I do in this space that leans into that which is energizing, right? And I just kept getting pulled and pulled and pulled in this direction. So when I sat down to think about starting an organization, I realized the approach is actually exactly what we've been doing at this session today. This kind of approach of, on the one hand, unlearning and unraveling, and then disrupting, but then also radically reimagining. And I think that radical reimagination is, I think all of those things have been present in this conversation, but is where we're getting that, that energy from this conversation that we're having today. So the last thing I want to share, as not even as a shameless plug, but just as what I've come to in my own process of thinking, what is my vision, right? And of course, I loved your comment before, Daniela, about Gandhi, and that we shouldn't be in this kind of one person obsessed way within our movements, and not to be trivial, but I started to think, be the change you want to see in the world. And my question became, well, what's the change I want to see in the world, and how can I be it, right? And I literally wrote that down on a piece of paper in relation to my work. And what I came to was a vision statement that is now becoming the vision statement of the Beyond Climate Collaborative, but is also my personal vision statement, of course. And I just want to share it as the conclusion before we go into the discussion. I envision a world where all people everywhere feel valued, embrace and celebrate their knowledge, and lean into their authentic gifts to create and inspire regenerative, transformative action toward a more just, sustainable, and resilient world for all. So this is what guides me in my work personally. But what I realized when I wrote this vision statement is it says nothing about climate change, climate mobility, it doesn't even say anything about justice, right? It's that, I think it's, yes, we have human rights and we have basic needs, and rights attached to those, to have roofs over our head and food in our bellies and water in our cups, and that list, thank goodness, goes on. But what we often forget to talk about is that we also need to feel safe. We need to feel secure. We need to feel loved. We need to feel valued, right? And I think that these are core tenets of the conversation, especially when we look at phenomena as uprooting as climate impacts, right? And human-caused environmental degradation and climate impacts, and mobility, migration, forced displacement, respectively, let alone the intersection between the two of them. So I just could not resist adding this into the mix of conversation. So with that, I guess I'll start by asking Steph if she's seen any questions in the chat that we should be pulling, or also to welcome you in, Steph. You've been patiently listening, nodding your head. But you're just as much of an organizer as this event as I have been. So I want to welcome you in. If you have reflections or questions or want to shine light on anything that's been going on in the chat. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I see that somebody already has a question, so I don't want to take much more time because I'm humbled by all of the speakers here. Thank you so much. This has been so beautiful, so intense. I'm super proud of Cosimo as well, representing my team, but of the other two speakers as well that were brought up by Lauren. I think this was a great mix. I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I hope all of you also did. And we're going to have the recording after, so in case we missed any bits and we want to revisit, you're more than welcome. I think MyCP, this is what we want to keep doing and to keep bringing to people, kind of food for thought and challenging ourselves. And I feel very challenged by you, Cosimo, you, Daniela, and you, Joy. And I think that's beautiful because I feel like I'm getting something out of here today, as I hope everyone here is as well. So yeah, without further ado, I really don't want you guys to listen to me, but I want to hear from all of you as well. I would like to maybe give the floor to, and I'm sorry for pronouncing names wrong. Perhaps we can go first with Lane, and then with Noura Yim, and then I saw that there are some hands up, and then we can go like that. So Lee.
Hi everybody, I'm Lee. It's been so nice to hear from everybody. Cosimo, thank you. Daniela, Joy, fantastic. Yeah, just so wonderful. I just wanted to kind of also be a little bit like Cosimo, to state my positionality. I think that's really important as we were kind of discussing about decoloniality. So I'm from the United States and I'm currently in the Ethnic and Migration Master Program at the University of Linköping. And I'm in my second year and I'm writing a master's thesis, hopefully about climate immobility, because I'm very interested in this topic. And so because I haven't been to the school or I've just done a couple of webinars. So I'm very new and I'm not sure what's been talked about. And I kind of want to hear everybody's perspective on this. But I think that immobility also has a lot of agency within that, because I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Farbocto. She's a scholar and she's really focused on Tuvalu, which is in the South Pacific, and about kind of this agency of, we've really discussed exhaustively, which is amazing, about these climate mobility regimes, kind of asking people, or not asking, but like forcing people to move because of climate change, but then also asking and kind of forcing people to move. And so she's done a lot of work about being able to stay, and because people want to stay, they have a connection to their land. And so I'm just kind of wondering, is this being discussed in this conversation at all about that in mobility, people have to stay because of economic resource and, you know, what we've talked about, capitalism and all of these things, but there's also an agency of like, I don't want to leave. I want to stay here in my land. And if I want to either adapt or try to mitigate, but I want to stay here because this is where I belong. And so I just was kind of curious, but again, I love everybody's conversation. It's been so great. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much for that question and for that perspective. And I love when people also introduce themselves and bring a little bit about their context so we understand. So I would say open floor, Joy, Cosimo, and Daniela. If any of you want to address it, please feel free to go. I think we can mix it up the order of before as well. Is there any of you that want to go first? Maybe Joy or Daniela? Maybe Joy, you were always the last, so you can be the first. Sorry. Don't want to put you on the spot there.
No, that's fine. No, I think, yeah, the right to stay is also a massive discourse in the whole climate mobility, immobility discussion. And it's so important. Oftentimes when we talk about mobility, we talk about just moving, but then we also need to remember that these are real people that we're talking about. And these are people with real connection to their heritage, with real connection to their land, with real connection to their ancestors who have plowed that land, who have fished on those waters, etc. And so I know Cosimo will be able to talk more about the anthropological discussions of all of this. He was nodding a lot earlier, and Daniela will talk about the very close connections of, say, indigenous peoples to their land, which is central to their lives, to our lives, really, honestly. But I think on a more policy level, this is also being discussed. This is what essentially the discussions of loss and damage is all about. And also, is there really such a thing as just compensation when you pay communities for when you need them to move, for when you have to displace them for whatever reason? The question is always, is there such a thing as just compensation? Can you equivocate your heritage, your ancestry, the people that your land, the land that your people have lived in for centuries, for a monetary amount? Can you make that into something economic? Can you put a number to that? And so those are also discussions in addition to the right of stay thing. But also, I guess from an anthropological and languaging perspective, it's so important to realize that so much of how we do climate discussions right now may come from a very Western adaptive response. And we really need to amplify and we really need to listen to the voices of those people whose lands will be swept away or go underwater because of climate change. They need to be part of the discussions. They need to take lead in the discussions. And that's often something we forget about. Sometimes we think, okay, they're going to be recipients of policies. We tend to forget that they're not recipients. They're the people on whose land. They're the people who live over the land that are being put on debate. So it's just always a question of like making sure that we decenter our perspectives, making sure that we listen to their perspectives and amplify their perspectives and use their perspectives when we make decision making in places where they may not have access to. So thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Joy. Cosimo and Daniela, you don't have to reply if you don't want to, but if you want, open floor. Daniela or Cosimo, you can just unmute and go.
So just something very quick because I really want to hear Cosimo's perspective. I think we often forget that we're witnessing that as we go. So like when we watch Palestinian people resist being expelled from their land, we are bearing witness to exactly that. When we speak of ecocide, not only from 1916 all the way until now, 1948, the Al-Nakba, we're speaking of all the intifadas. We're speaking about people in the south of Lebanon sticking to their cedar trees. This is also the right to stay and remain on your ancestral land. But beyond that, it is also understanding that trying to also mask the story, the history of militarism and of extractivism, especially in the Pacific, I would really encourage, if you can, to do the ISCM lay, because they give amazing opportunities, for example, to do capstone projects. And so I was able to do the capstone project with ICAD, and I actually learned about what really happens with the extractivism and the militarization of that zone in the world, and what that has done, for example, in the Solomon Islands, what that has done to the indigenous peoples who don't even get informed consent before their land is used to extract valuable minerals, which are then used to create the weapons that are then being now used against our brothers and sisters in the global majority all over the world, whether that is Sudan, again, Congo, Palestine, Lebanon right now, as we're speaking, as we're having this conversation. So I really encourage you to join that community if you have an opportunity, because if you can do that, then you have really the blessing to then have direct contact, learn and really collaborate and be able to continue that conversation on a practical level, but then really expand your knowledge of the interconnectedness of everything that we just touched on. So Cosimo, I'll go ahead and toss that on to you.
Thank you so much for your answers, but especially to the question, because I think actually we talk a lot about different things in this discussion, but we didn't dive in depth about the concept of immobility, which of course within the Western academia, as we can also see, I think like I'm familiar a bit with the International School on Climate Mobilities, but I think also I noticed that in the coming or in the past years or in the past months, actually the terms of also organizations have started to implement this idea of also including the term I am, before mobilities to, of course, enforce this concept. In anthropology, we talk about stasis, this idea of staying, but at the same time, there are different nuances in understanding why is this person staying. There is like a voluntarily aspect behind it, or there is also a form of forced displacement. And I'm sorry, Leia, I don't know if it's actually I pronounced it correctly, your name, but I am a bit very shortly, briefly familiar with the context of Tuvalu in the Pacific, because I remember there was a classmate of mine who brought it up in a discussion. And I think a very important point that this classmate of mine brought within this context is that there is often an overgeneralization, especially when we talk about cultural ties linked to this context. Because unfortunately, a lot of perspectives that talk about this context in Tuvalu, they tend to portray these forms of cultural ties as some sort of fatalistic views, which is also very problematic to a certain extent, because you kind of also do not reflect on the religious aspect behind it. But not only the religious, there is a cultural aspect that you have to take into account. So you have to also understand the right of the person to stay within this certain context. But on the other hand, we also have to not overgeneralize the cultural ties behind it, because of course, not all the people are staying within that specific context because of a cultural as well as a religion aspect. So sometimes I think within this context, my classmate was enforcing this idea, of course, in a way also intersectionality, because some of also these displaced communities that are displaced voluntarily or forced because of a situation of stasis, this situation of stasis is also caused by some lack of means, financial, logistical, and social, which further contribute to this form of immobility. So in that case, is it voluntarily or is it also displaced? Of course, we have to reflect on it, and we also, the important aspect of it, especially us from the West, as you were also saying that we're originally from the United States, we need to just and simply not overgeneralize this aspect. And if you would have the interest to engage within this topic, of course, to often not rely on whatever has been written in a Western piece of article, because a lot of times immobility is still overgeneralized, and there is still this idea sometimes of also only including the voluntarily aspect without also seeing the combination between voluntarily aspect as well as some forms of displacement, which are also caused by this lack of means. But if I can, I will try to be briefly about it. I talk about this concept of immobility more within my master thesis, which was focusing in the context of Kenya, as I mentioned before. And there was this specific case study of, for example, Somali displaced communities because of climate change that are acknowledged, some of them are acknowledged as some forms of Somali refugees, but a lot of times it's difficult to reflect on this case study, because if you reflect on the history, so when we talk about the historic dimensions of these forms of displacement, historically there were not necessarily some forms of climate change related hazards, but the main reasons when we were talking about the 90s, the main reasons of their movement was caused by a conflict. The point is that when climate change hazards have also worsened in 2016, of course, especially because of drought and arid conditions in the context of Somalia, there have been more layers to take into account when we reflect about their forms of displacement. But of course, a lot of them are still not acknowledged as displaced communities because of climate change, but oftentimes this is still strictly related to a conflict-related reason. But what I mean is that some of these refugees sometimes, Somali displaced refugees, they tend to be oftentimes, not generalize, they reside in this Dadaab refugee context, which is of course like one of the main and biggest refugee camps in the world, and especially in the Kenyan context. And there is a layer of immobility in that case that sometimes we have to take into account, because some of these displaced Somali communities cannot come back to the same their land. Sometimes also because it's a voluntary choice, but sometimes because there are also drought and arid conditions as well as flooding conditions, so climate change hazards that affect the Dadaab refugee camp. So do you understand, sometimes we really need to reflect, and it's super complicated to reflect on so many layers, and it's very individual. It's often a very individual cause. So my only advice, which I also gave to myself, is to often not overgeneralize the findings that we read from research papers that talk about immobility, especially in the context of stasis. I talk a bit, sorry.
No worries. I didn't want to interrupt because that was great, and I love that you were on the flow. Thank you so much, Cosimo, and thank you, Lee, for this question. I'm mindful. I want to be really mindful of people's times, especially because a lot of people joining us from all over the world, and for some of us it's late. So we have 10 more minutes. I know that there was one question here in the chat, and then maybe some couple of hands as well. So if we can try, I know it's hard, guys, because we're very passionate about the topic, to keep our questions short, but also our answers kind of short. So I want to ask maybe if Nuraim wants to come in and ask their question.
Hi, everyone. Do you hear me well? Just confirming. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So first of all, just quickly would like to thank all of you that the space, the discussion was so inspiring and dynamic. And I just want to add to Lauren what she was saying, that recently I've been visiting some conferences of NGOs, of intergovernmental organizations, and it was so different from what we have now here. It was so, artificial, limited, or even filtered, because no one raised the topic of Palestine, for example. And it felt so like artificial, as I already said. So it was very different. So that's why I'm super happy to be here today and have these meaningful discussions with you. So my question would be about, I guess, to all of you who would like to answer about how your decolonization started, because I think it's a very important step. The first steps, if I will come back to my background, I am from Kyrgyzstan, which is a post-Soviet country. And I've been noticing that we have this decolonization optic just starting. So we are very in the beginning of the first steps of decolonization of our minds. But I've been thinking as well that decolonization, first to come to decolonization, you have to be privileged, right? You have to get access to education. So you have to have these means in order to reflect that. But on the other hand, people in rural areas that don't have access to central education, etc., they are already decolonized. So this is an interesting observation that I think. So just want to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuraim. That's an amazing question. I love it. I'm just going to keep the floor open, and Joy, Cosimo, and Daniela, you can come in as you like, very organically.
Maybe Daniela, you can start if you want. I often started before.
Okay, so just very quickly, thank you for highlighting that point. I think it's very, very true. What I can tell you from my personal experience, which would not be the experience of everyone, is that decoloniality, not in those terms, has been a part of my life forever. But on a very personal level, what I can share with you is that when you are a part of an indigenous community that is being extinguished by the repercussions of colonialism and capitalism, maybe we don't call it decoloniality, but it's what you live every day, especially if you're forcibly displaced. And so we have a word for a person who's in between territory, sacred territory, and then the Western world. And sometimes it's a very violent world. Sometimes it's a world where you're consistently being attacked. And you have to meet people where they are, because people do a lot of good things with good intentions, but with horrible consequences, the principle of do no harm, right? And so it was more learning the language of how to speak to them about something that has been a part of my life always by virtue of my identity. And maybe you have had that same experience. How do you explain to someone, for example, the history of Kurdistan, the history of the Kurdish peoples, because it's not just in Kurdistan, unfortunately, and it's still not recognized completely. So the sovereignty element is missing. So I mean, the radicalization maybe took place when I finally found my voice and I was finally able to sit there and say, I can speak about something because I see so many people also living the same. And maybe if I hadn't lived the horrible experience of being uprooted from everything I loved and knew, I wouldn't have had that opportunity. So even in the painful process, there was something good that came out of it, with the opportunity to be able to then grow in that community and learn from others, such as people from Kurdistan. Something I probably would have never known, would have never been exposed to, right? Because I was too focused on the survival itself. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. I'll pass it on to the others now.
I think I have a tiny bit to say, but that was a wonderful question. And I think it's always just reminding like it's a process. The first time I realized it was in school when we were talking about how the Philippines was discovered by a Portuguese envoy by Spain. And I was like, how is something discovered, really? So that was the first of it. And then it just continued. And then my most recent like realization or coming to grips with decoloniality was being here, feeling this climate affect, not of climate anxiety, but of climate guilt, of the fact that I am in Edinburgh while my family, the people that I love, are having to deal with waste high waters. Because in the last 2 months, 2 typhoons hit the country, and both of those typhoons flooded my parents' house. And being away from my parents, it's just the stark reality that this is my lived reality. This is why I am radicalized. This is why, because this is an understanding that this is not an isolated issue. The flooding is not an isolated issue. My parents live like at the foot of a mountain range. This happened because of so many things that happened in the past: systemic injustice, colonialism, pillaging of forest, deforestation, etc., extractive industries that have led us to where we are now. And I guess it's always just a daily reckoning, just waking up and then realizing that there is much more to learn and there is much more to do.
I will just then briefly say, in my case, it's a bit different, I would say, because I think, all my life as a Italian guy, when you're born in Italy and maybe you're good in math and physics, you just tend to, they're like, the society tends to tell you, oh, you're gonna be an engineer or you're gonna end up, doing something scientific. So all my life, I never fully engaged with politics until I live in the United States when I was 17, and I live with a Trump supporter family. And I think that was the most eye-opening experience for me. And I came back after that experience when I was 17, and I said to my parents, I'm sorry, I'm not going to become an engineer. And after that, I think there has been there has been like a situation after another, which led me to reflect, of course. At the beginning already, I was thinking about Christopher Columbus and, of course, the European colonization of the Americas. But to me, because in Italy, it was portrayed and we were educated differently in these regards. So I think I was not using the term decoloniality yet, but I was, of course, already engaging and understanding some colonial legacies behind this discussion. And the term decoloniality itself came to my life more on a conceptual level, definition level during my bachelor, because I had an incredible teacher from Iran that, in a way, even within this sustainability and development framework, has been able to kind of implement more courses related to decolonizing the concept of global health as well as activism. So I've been very privileged that specific teacher. And then, of course, with my migration studies program, it's all based on reflecting on these aspects, and we try and we fail, of course, from a more decolonial as well as post-colonial perspective. It's difficult. Oftentimes, it's still new to me, but I still believe that this is what we have to try to do when we engage with every topic, especially from the West.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, Cosimo, Daniela, and Joy. Amazing answers and very inspiring to see your journey on that process. I saw that there were 2 hands before. I don't know if you still want to come in or if people already needed to leave. This is the time. Speak now or... Yeah, Malika, please go ahead. And if that's okay for everyone, that will be the last question, just because, yeah, otherwise we will go a little bit too much over time. Super sorry if we were not able to take your question today as well. Feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, we can continue this conversation in another place. But Malika, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, I'll have to be very clear about one thing. I'm very inspired by all of you guys, and I've learned so much about that today, about decolonialing and all of these stuff. It was so insightful. Thank you so much for sharing all this insightful information with us today. And as an Indigenous people, I've been always advocating for the rights of these people, as I'm witnessing now with us some examples, some rural models that I'm getting inspired so much from. I have a question to be just very concise and to be short. It was addressed mainly for Daniela, for being a strong representative of her community, of the Indigenous people. My question was, how can we integrate the Indigenous and marginalized groups through leadership into a global climate negotiations and discussions? How can we promote this kind of people so they can be able to advocate for their rights and voice up themselves? And thank you.
Amazing
Thank you so
question.
much, Malika. Yes, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
No, Daniela, go ahead. I wanted to say the floor is yours.
No, thank you so much. So I also want to just quickly, before I answer your question, Malika, Nurai, I'm so sorry that I misheard Kurdistan for Kyrgyzstan. I'm so sorry. It's also me, like with headphones, so I'm so sorry, but amazing too. Also peoples who I feel like we don't know enough about or hear about. So I'm sorry about that. Just wanted to shout that out real quick. And thank you for correcting me in the comment.
You really don't have to be sorry. You really don't have to be sorry. This is so innocent. We love you.
Thank you. So that's so sweet. So Malika, I think this is crucial, and this is why people like you are so important, because these are the questions and these are the conversations we need to be tackling and asking and working towards. So the first would be at a very base level to empower, especially women, Indigenous women, who often suffer the violence and the persecution and the marginalization to another level. I'm not saying the men do not. The men also get vilified and often reduced to their power in terms of militarism and combat, which is extremely dehumanizing, extremely horrible, as if they too do not have emotions. But that's a whole nother psychological conversation. Also, as land defenders and as people who resist occupation, resist the coloniality and the perpetuation of these systems, women hold so much knowledge, whether it's in the tradition of music, of childbearing, of art, of cooking, of singing, and so it really is about empowering those women. And when I say empowering, it means amongst each other, because very oftentimes I think what is missing in the conversation is how much we've let the powers that control our lives divide us and stick us against each other with tools of fear. So I fear you because I do not understand you. I do not understand you because my access to you has been cut off. So even if our ancestors shared a common bond and exchanged things with each other, which they did, or even with diasporas later on when displacement occurred due to other wars and other conflicts, there's a huge diaspora of Lebanese people, of Iraqi people in Colombia. We have been exposed to that. We have welcomed you. We have taken you in as we should, as brothers and sisters in the land. But then discourses by the Western media and Western propaganda have then riddled us to factions of like, okay, are you from another religion? Are you from another belief? Going back to what Cosimo was talking about with like culture, religion, cosmologies, what does the West define as that? And how do they use that to vilify us? We need to stop that. So if I see you and if I see you at a conference and I'm listening to you, I'm really taking that in, and I'm not just listening to hear what you're saying. I'm listening so that I can implement that into the beliefs that I've been shoved down my throat with social media, with the barrage of propaganda, and say, no, we're not doing that. I'm really going to listen to you. And as another woman and as another Indigenous woman, I'm going to listen to what resistance looks like to you and what we can do with each other, valuing the beauty that you carry from something that has been used against you and against me, and not allowing that to happen. So at a base level, then on a very practical level, really wanting to know and reach out and bond. So I shared those resources in the comments, especially communities like the ISCM, Politics for Her, women-led places and spaces. You can do podcasts, do videos, really to see you, to see your beauty. So like, for example, I'm going to mention something real quick. You're a hijabi woman. This is beautiful. This means that you have taken upon yourself within your own relationship with your divine entity to go into a space where you feel safe, where you feel comfortable. And the world needs to learn how to respect that. The world needs to learn how to acknowledge that that is not a tool of oppression. That is a tool of empowerment for you. So it is something that I had to learn. I had to sit down and learn, and that was a privilege. But with that privilege comes the responsibility, right? And so it really is about empowering, for example, those key messages, especially in a place like Europe. I live in Italy. Sometimes I go to France, and when I go to France and I occupy certain spaces, I feel attacked. I can never begin to imagine what it is like for a woman like you. And so that is my responsibility, to hear you, to listen to you, to see you, and then to allow you to occupy spaces if I can, to channel that through, and we can do that for each other. So those are just two main steps, and I really encourage you to use your voice, to use any tools, your grandmother, your mother, your sisters, your cousins, to really hone that in, and then really push that out in whatever way you feel most comfortable doing so.
That's amazing, Daniela. I couldn't ask for a better ending, inspire ending for this amazing webinar, which I'm sorry that it has to end. Imagine if all of us would be in person. That would be the amazing time of coffee and cookies and even more inspiring chit chat. But oh well, we're gonna stay with the online version for now. But thank you so much for the question, Malika, as well. And thank you again so much to our speakers, for Lauren, for co-organizing this event. I just want to quickly take the opportunity to first of all share here on the chat something that we here in ICP have been leading, where we've been working in the past few months, and we're gonna continue working on a global Climate Mobilities Youth Declarations. We would love to hear your voice. This is a part one of another set of input gathering that we are doing, an effort, and we're planning of having online consultations next year to gather people's inputs as well. So this is a pre-warning, and we would love to have you as well. So just to end and also to stay in touch, I saw that there were some people already sharing their LinkedIns and websites. So please feel free to follow all of these amazing organizations on social media. So here I have my CP's social media handles and our website as well, if you just scan that. But you can also find us easily online. The Beyond Climate Collaborative and the International Schools for Climate Mobilities as well. So with that, I want to give the last word to Lauren as well, if she wants to say something. And from my side, I wish everyone a good rest of the day, good afternoon, and good night if you're going to bed already. Yeah, Lauren, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to reiterate the gratitude back at you, Steph, for all of your work in putting this event together. Thank you to you and the MyCP team. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to Joy and Cosimo and Daniela for your provocations, really. I mean, I think none of us are leaving this session without a lot to think about. And I want to thank everyone who's here. I think it's been cool to have an intimate space. And I think your showing up here and being here already says a lot about, you know, beginning to do this work, right? To seek these spaces out. And I know that I think Steph with MyCP, and I think a lot of you on the call are probably really committed to creating more spaces to be having these conversations. So not to advance shameless plugs, but more to just actually stay connected and to co-create and to collaborate and to pioneer new spaces for more kind of unlearning, unraveling, disrupting, and radical reimagination of what this work can look like, I think are welcome. So thank you all. I echo Steph on the good morning, good day, good night. Thanks for being here, and thanks again to our speakers.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.